Thank you for attending today's researcher talk, the second on the very busy month of May. I'm Richard McCulley. I'm the historian at the Center for Legislative Archives that sponsors this series. A quick look ahead at the researcher talk scheduled for June and July before we take a break in August, as we always do, and resume the series in September on the 15th. On July 23rd, we'll hear from Tammy Ingram, Associate Professor of History at the College of Charleston, who has researched Kefauver investigation records last summer and earlier this year. Her talk is titled, Dear Senator, Estes Kefauver and the Anti-Crime Crusade in the South. Then on July 14th, we host Kate Mazur, Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University, who has made several stops at the center over the last couple of years to conduct petitions research. Her talk is titled, Black Sailors and Citizenship in the Era of the Gag Rule. Today, we're very pleased to have Magdalena Krajewska, who is an assistant professor of political science at Wingate University. She received her undergraduate degree in government and economics at the London School of Economics and received a PhD in political science at Brandeis University with a dissertation that examined the political history of ID card proposals in the United States and the United Kingdom. She has received numerous academic awards and fellowships, including a Research Circle on Democracy and Cultural Pluralism Fellowship, a Mellon Summer Research Grant, and a Jean and Robert Benjamin Fellowship in International Affairs. She has made presentations on her work at conferences and seminars in London, Berlin, Warsaw, Chicago, Boston, and Seattle, and she is, as we said earlier, on her way to Nashville and the Policy History Conference next week to make another presentation. We first met Magdalena 3 years ago when she was conducting research at the center, so we are very pleased to finally work you into this program. Thank you very much for joining us today. We should have time for question and answers after the talk, so please remember to raise your hand so we can pass you the microphone.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Richard, for the introduction. I'm Magdalena Krajewska, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at Wingate University, just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. It is an absolute honor to be here. I've been researching here for a few years now. I love the National Archives. I love this building. I love the staff. I love all the materials, and to be invited to be able to speak on this topic is just an incredible honor. And I would love to take the opportunity to thank Richard McCulley for the invitation, and also Richard for all the help you've given me over the years. Pulling all those materials for me. It really has been a very, 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 very huge help for me. You, Bill Davis, all the other archivists have really went above and beyond. So thank you to you all for that. I will talk today about my research on the politics and history of identification documents, especially national ID cards, from 1915 to the present. The book manuscript I am working on fills an important void since there is no published book-length comprehensive political history of national ID card proposals and debates in the United States. In my research, I examined primary materials here at the National Archives and also at the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress. I conducted dozens of in-depth, high-level interviews with politicians, policymakers, technology experts, and civil libertarians, and I also analyzed public opinion data. National ID cards are used in many countries to confirm work eligibility, provide access to government services, ensure the legitimacy of voting, and for many other purposes. American policymakers are not currently considering the adoption of national ID cards, and there is little informed public debate on the subject. In fact, the conventional wisdom is that Americans are and have always been staunchly opposed to national ID cards. But the historical evidence reveals a more complicated story. In the past, some policymakers and members of the public have supported proposals for national ID cards, and many today see national ID cards more positively than conventional wisdom would let us believe. Now, let me be clear. Passionate opposition to national ID cards has been and remains present. But some policymakers and members of the public see national ID cards more positively than conventional wisdom would let us believe. My presentation will focus on a number of historical episodes during which Americans considered introducing national ID cards. I will look primarily at the proposals put forward during World War II, and then also briefly mention proposals put forward in the 1970s and very briefly in the years after 9/11. My research shows that popular support for national ID cards, as measured by opinion polls, letters to Congress, and letters to newspapers, has been significant over the last 100 years, and in fact, at several points in time, represented a majority view. This might not be an earth-shattering piece of information, but given that opponents of national ID cards often say that Americans are and have always been staunchly opposed to national ID cards, it is an important piece of information. I find that proposals for national ID cards that were raised by American policymakers and members of the public between 1915 and 2015, and the support those proposals generated, emerged in response to threats, real and perceived, to national security and national identity. All the proposals for national ID cards in the United States have been linked to wars, to terrorist attacks, and to immigration. Today, identification documents feature in many current controversies, including those over immigration reforms, identity theft, voter ID laws, profiling of terrorist suspects, the Real ID Act, the issuance of driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, etc. And again, the United States is unlikely to introduce national ID cards in the future, but will surely see continuing challenges to identity policing and to identification practices. Before going any further, it is helpful to consider where the United States fits in a comparative perspective. Political scientist Arsteid Zollberg noted that Europeans accept as routine the requirement to have a universal government-issued identification documents. They even view it as a positive from a civil liberties perspective because it provides some degree of protection against arbitrary police behavior. However, within the American context, the public would perceive it, and I quote, to alter profoundly the established balance between freedom and control, end of quote. Sociologist Joseph Eaton argued that in the United States, a national ID card is a taboo. There are taboos in every culture, he said, ideas regarded by conventional wisdom as inherently evil and unacceptable. The national ID roster represents such a taboo in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. Writing in 1986, Eaton said that specialists know that vital statistics records are an open invitation to the fraudulent acquisition of false identity records. However, many of them fear to express views favorable to comprehensive ID card reform that are apt to be labeled reactionary or insensitive to the risk of preparing the groundwork for totalitarianism. Now, the national ID card controversies in the United States stand in contrast to most European countries, such as Germany and Poland, where national identification documents are part of everyday life. Most people do not give them a second thought, and politically, they're really a non-issue. Countries that have compulsory ID cards normally require citizens to apply for them at the age of 18, carry it with them once they turn 18. Generally, ID cards contain name, gender, a date and place of birth, a photograph, a national identification number, etc. I have some examples of what national ID cards look like in Germany, what they look like in Poland, and in terms of their prevalence worldwide, they're pretty widespread in that over 100 countries have national ID cards, including 26 of the 34 OECD countries that have national ID cards. The United States, of course, is not one of them. Now, I want to make this very clear. I am not advocating for or against national ID cards. I recognize that there are very strong arguments both in favor and against national ID cards in general and in this country. Just very briefly, I want to say that national ID cards may help address problems related to illegal immigration. They may have security and terrorism prevention benefits, but they are not in and of themselves solutions to the complex problems of today's world. No system is foolproof. If properly designed and implemented under suitable oversight, national ID cards may have the potential to help address at least some of the problems. Generally speaking, I would say the advantages of ID cards, you can kind of think of advantages being either from the point of view of the government or from the point of view of the people, right? For governments, it's obviously helpful to know who everyone is, right? And if there's a suspicion of a person, being a terrorist, that person can be tracked, right? If they have a national ID card that they need to use, they can be helpful to law enforcement authorities. From the point of view of the people, if you have a national ID card, it can help an individual be legible, right, in the eyes of the state. Individuals can kind of count, right, in the eyes of the state, which in turn can help them ensure access to all sorts of rights, including voting. Again, confirm work eligibility, demonstrate eligibility for public services and other benefits. As far as the disadvantages of ID cards are concerned, they're certainly very strong as well. I would say that opposition to national ID cards, generally speaking, in this country, consists of both principled and pragmatic arguments. So they're principled arguments that result from the serious erosion of civil liberties, concerns about freedom and privacy, government exercising unjustified control over people, concerns about Big Brother, slippery slope, all sorts of unjustified originally undeclared purposes of national ID cards. And many people also worry about the kind of dehumanizing effects of national ID cards, about being reduced to a number. The pragmatic arguments focus on concerns about the cost of the scheme, worries about the dangers of the data loss, and the increased potential for identity theft. And those concerns about ID cards absolutely cannot be dismissed. If we look at the historical examples of when the United States experimented with ID programs, there were some occasions which were certainly very disturbing. If you think about the Japanese Americans during World War II, and the identification tags they were issued, it kind of makes you realize why so many people still today associate those documents with oppression. And in fact, in the early days of the country, there were all sorts of identification documents and written passes and other identification devices which elsewhere in the world were precursors to national ID cards. In this country, they never developed into national ID cards, but they were demanded of slaves, for instance, right? But not of others. So again, you can kind of see why many people associate those documents or those devices with some dehumanizing practices from the past. If you look at the late 19th century and the climate of xenophobia, right? You again see the U.S. government issuing special identification documents to the Chinese in America. And when you look at the beginning of the 20th century and World War I in particular, you again see the U.S. government issuing identification documents to enemy aliens, right? So again, the hostility towards German Americans was very strong, and German Americans were actually asked to have identification documents and to carry them. And in fact, in early 1918, when the registration process for German Americans started, the German Americans have by and large registered without an incident, and nearly 500,000 people have actually carried those documents during this time. That registration, of course, ended with the end of World War I, but nevertheless, 500,000 people carried those ID cards. But what I want to focus most in my presentation is the period of World War II. And during this period of World War II, we had proposals for registration of all aliens in 1940, proposals for registration of enemy aliens in 1942, and multiple proposals for identification documents for all US citizens, i.e. national ID cards. I will just briefly discuss the first two. The first two were actually implemented, right? So the first two, the registration of aliens and the registration of enemy aliens, and the ID cards for both of those groups, they happened, right? The proposals for Americans were put forward, but they never materialized. So again, just very briefly, the first proposal that did end up materializing, 1940, the Alien Registration Act, the so-called Smith Act. Many of you might be familiar with for other reasons. One of the things that the Smith Act required was that all aliens 14 years of age or older who remain in the United States for over 30 days need to register and submit fingerprints. And between August and December of 1940, more than 4.7 million people in the United States registered. They were required to have, but not to carry, an identification card. That was the difference from the other proposals. But they were required to have a registration card. And then, as far as the enemy aliens were concerned, in January of 1942, President Roosevelt issued a proclamation requiring every enemy alien 14 years of age or older to apply for a certificate of identification, and by the end of spring, when the government completed the registration effort, they issued 1.1 million of those certificates to enemy aliens. The Department of Justice, in fact, argued that the identification certificate will protect the alien. Those new cards will give evidence of aliens' peaceful disposition and of desire to conform with the laws of the United States, and they had to be carried on the person to whom they were issued at all times. Okay, so those were the two things that happened. In addition, in 1942, we also saw those identification tags for Japanese Americans during the internment, and of course, we're talking of 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom, as we know, were actually US citizens. Those tags were discontinued in 1946, but again, they left to many a bitter impression with those identification methods. But again, what I want to focus most on are those proposals for identification documents for US citizens, right? So proposals for what we now think of as national ID cards. And I'm very excited that I was able to discover a lot of really, really great and useful material here at the National Archives, because this is really part of history that has not been analyzed and examined. And as I said, there's no kind of comprehensive written history of those proposals. So I was extremely excited to be able to discover it and look through this. So during World War II, a number of congressmen, a number of organizations, and a number of private citizens introduced proposals for national ID cards and also universal fingerprinting of US citizens, though none of those proposals were ultimately successful. So despite those modern-day claims that American people despise national ID cards, the historical evidence suggests that ID proposals have generated not only significant opposition, but also significant support. Many people wrote letters to Congress and also to newspapers either in support or in opposition to ID card legislation in World War II. And again, my manuscript is the first to analyze those letters contained here in the National Archives. And I think it's important to pay attention to those letters because they show us the side of the story that we have really never seen before, right? Namely, what did regular Americans think about identification documents? So let me start with the first proposal that was put forward right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 17th, 1941, Representative Carter Manasco, who was a Democrat from Alabama, introduced a bill, H.R. 6256, which would require all U.S. citizens over the age of 16 to carry identification card. And if the bill passed, it would have become the Citizen Identification Act of 1942. The bill required every person to apply for registration and fingerprinting. The person would receive an identification card, which would contain a general description of the person, including the name, sex, date of birth, fingerprints, and whether the person was a native-born or a naturalized citizen. And people would have to carry the cards on them at all times when away from home. And the bill generated a lot of attention. So I had a great time looking for all the documents connected to the bill. This is just an example of what a lot of the correspondence looked like. Some of it came on little postcards. They were all addressed to Hatton Summers, who was the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, to which the bill was referred. And many were actually long letters. Some of them were handwritten, some of them were typed. It was really absolutely fascinating just to see how many of those different letters and postcards were there. And what was interesting for me as a political scientist is that even though the bill was introduced right after the shocking attack on Pearl Harbor, many people wrote to Sumner actually telling him to defeat H.R. 6256. Most of those letters date back to June 1942. And even though we were talking about the height of the war effort, and one would think that if there ever was a time, right, to introduce national ID cards, maybe that was the time. I certainly thought that Americans would universally support the legislative proposal aimed at helping the war effort. Many people strongly opposed the measure. So I do have a lot of evidence of that opposition. One woman wrote that the bill is, I quote, very undemocratic and un-American, end of quote. She said she is very much opposed to placing all our people under such restrictions. Another woman described the bill as Hitler's. Now, the references to Hitler were fairly rare, I have to say, but they did happen. This notion that ID cards are un-American is the one that kind of came up over and over again in those letters. And in fact, even today, people who oppose national ID cards, right, mention this, that ID cards are un-American. So we saw this in World War II, which is the period I focus on, but we also saw it in World War I. We saw it in the 1970s, and we certainly see it today. In addition to principled arguments against ID cards, letter writers to Congress during World War II also brought up pragmatic arguments. I have an example of one person who's writing that she opposes H.R. 6256 because identification cards would enable employers to discriminate against older job seekers upon learning their true age. So people were concerned about practical implications of having an ID card that would state what your true age was. However, there was also significant support for the bill and for the national ID cards. And I have some examples of where that support came from. The International Association of Chiefs of Police, headquartered here in Washington, D.C., gave its unequivocal approval for universal fingerprinting and for compulsory identification cards for all US citizens. In March 1942, Edward J. Kelly, who was the executive secretary, told Sumners that for over 40 years, the association has been urging legislation along similar lines. The association added, H.R. 6256 is of particular importance at this time when there is great possibility of enemy air raids. The resulting casualties would include a large number of maimed bodies, the identification of which would be impossible at the present time because of a lack of a national file of fingerprints of all citizens. And the association made a very important point. They said that the Alien Registration Act extends this protection of assured identity to aliens, and our citizens should be permitted to enjoy the same security. And I thought that was really interesting, right? That stressing that aliens had a protection that the citizens lacked, I thought was it was a very persuasive argument. The International Association of Chiefs of Police felt so strongly about national ID cards that it urged Congress to support H.R. 6256 not only as a vitally needed emergency measure, but also as a statute that would be of equal value also in times of peace. Now, support for peacetime national ID cards was also evident among members of Congress. For instance, Representative Philip Traynor, Democrat from Delaware, expressed his support for the bill, saying that it's worthwhile and necessary, and that measure should be supported, especially for the duration of the war, but also afterwards. Individual police departments also wrote in support of H.R. 6256. In February of 1942, Police Department in Alameda, California, wrote that this bill is one of the most excellent contributions to wartime efficiency. Another voice of support came from the International Association for Identification, which was the world's leading forensic science identification association. In September of 1942, they unanimously passed a resolution in support of this bill. Members of the American Legion, a veterans organization, also wrote in support. And then finally, so did many ordinary people. Mrs. Brimmer from Jacksonville, Florida, wrote in November of 1942 that she worried about foreign agents, a fifth columnist, and dangerous escaped criminals. She said that the cost of fingerprinting and national ID cards would be small compared to the benefits received. A number of other people wrote with kind of similar statements, but in the end, nothing came out of the bill. Nothing came out of the bill, despite the support of police professionals, forensic experts, veterans, and congressmen and regular people. This attempt to introduce national ID cards for all Americans died in 1942. However, in the 78th Congress, there were more national ID card bills and more evidence, again, how passionate people were about those ID card proposals. In January of 1943, we actually saw an introduction of two bills. They were identical in favor of national ID cards. One was in the House, one was in the Senate. In January of 1943, Representative Raymond Springer, Republican from Indiana, introduced Bill H.R. 1032, which would require all U.S. citizens over the age of 16 to carry identification cards. And on the same day, Senator Walgren, a Democrat from Washington, introduced Bill S-313, which would also require that. And anyone subject to this legislation would have to carry the identification card on his person at all times while away from home. Now, the House bill, interestingly, did not receive a lot of attention. The Senate bill did, which I found very, very interesting as I was looking for the archives. Pretty much everyone who wrote just about the Senate bill, even though they were identical. Many people wrote to the Senate in April and May of 1943, asking Frederick Van Nuys, who was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to defeat the bill in committee. A number of people said they opposed the Walgren bill since, again, such proposals are un-American. We had a letter from Ms. Hyman from New Jersey. She was one of the people who wrote in. She said she regarded the bill as un-American, undemocratic, and against everything for which we are now fighting. Another woman wrote that she felt the bill is reminiscent of the methods used in the old Tsarist Russia and revived under the Gestapo of Germany, and she did not feel that such a law should exist in democracy. Miss Estelle Cohen of Brooklyn wrote that the bill smacks of the Gestapo surveillance. Miss Rose Leonard from Pennsylvania wrote that the ID card law would be contrary to the free spirit of our democratic land. And this set of letters that I'm quoting from, I think is very representative of the kind of arguments people made historically against national ID cards. Now, in June, so just a few months after that, in June of 1943, Senator William Langer, Republican from North Dakota, introduced a bill that was almost identical to the Walgren's bill S313, but the Langer bill, Bill S1191, would also require U.S. citizens to carry identification cards, but it would actually require that from people who were 12 years of age or older. So not 16, but actually 12 years or older. Again, nothing came out of this bill either, or nothing also came out from the subsequent Springer bills. In fact, the bills received support. They received opposition from the public and from the organization. You can see how passionate some of those congressmen were about the bills. Representative Springer, for instance, not only did he push for the bill in 1943, but he also pushed for the same bill 2 years later in January of 1945, and again 2 years after that in January of 1947. So there were people who really felt extremely passionate about it, and they kept on suggesting this as an option for years. Now, shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Gallup poll revealed, that was in February 1942, that 69% of Americans believe that everyone in the United States should be required to carry an identification card, including, among other things, the picture and the fingerprints. Only 25% of the people opposed this idea. So those are pretty significant numbers. Now, we know that the Gallup poll data from this period comes from a skewed sample of the public. We know that, but I think we're still getting a sense of the strength of the public opinion on this topic. In addition to the Gallup poll, the strength of the public opinion was also evident in the letters people wrote to newspapers. And I have analyzed the letters that people wrote to the New York Times and to the Los Angeles Times, among other newspapers. And many people argued that the good derived from national identification system more than offsets whatever disadvantages might exist in such systems. One New York Times reader who used to live in South America and was now living in West Virginia spoke highly of ID cards required of all citizens in many foreign countries. He said that no law-abiding American can honestly object to such measures, and Congress should see the need of identification in the present emergency and pass a measure requiring complete registration. One argument in favor of ID cards was that anonymity or undisclosed identity enabled criminals. In the letter to the New York Times, one reader from New York called for a domestic passport identification, which would act as a crime deterrent to all Americans. There were many arguments from people saying that the society that allows this state of affair, right, not having a national ID card, is only, and I quote, rendering its own structure vulnerable to attack from within. End of quote. So those were pretty passionate letters. Some Americans also argued that national ID cards and national registration would have a tremendous psychological effect. They would strengthen national consciousness by showing everybody that he is a registered member of our democratic community and of our common national efforts. Some argued that ID cards would emphasize the value of citizenship. There was a medical doctor in California who proposed a national ID card issued to every newborn child. And he argued that the citizen of the United States of America needs to have something like this to impress him with the value of his citizenship. Now, despite this public opinion support, despite the efforts of all the Congress people during this time frame, no national ID card was introduced. What we did see in the 1930s and 1940s was the development of driver's licenses and social security numbers and social security cards. Now, I'm not planning to talk about this during the talk, but I'll happily talk about this too during the Q&A if you would like me to. What I would like to do, just very quickly, is talk about some of the proposals that were put forward later on in the 20th century, once we were out of the wartime situation. And of particular interest to me are the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we had two very important public figures, Francis G. Knight and Fyodor Hesburgh, who both supported national ID cards, although independently from each other. Frances G. Knight was the director of the Passport Office. She was a very interesting person, expert bureaucrat. Many of her contemporaries describe her as the J. Edgar Hoover of the State Department. And in February of 1975, she gave a statement on the benefits of a national ID card, which caused a political storm. It really was absolutely fascinating just to see what happened. She gave an interview to the U.S. News and World Report, and she said that the United States was facing a huge fraud crisis and a huge illegal immigration crisis. And she says that her personal opinion was that the U.S. government owes every American a true recorded identity to protect him from criminal impersonations, which can and often do result in blackmail, financial loss, and embarrassment. She says that national registration eventually will come to this country because it will be demanded by citizens who are sick and tired of supporting non-tax-paying criminals and illegal aliens. This will involve, in due course, the issuance of a national ID card with fingerprints to every citizen. She acknowledged that any proposal for a nationwide registration of all American citizens is loaded with political dynamite and touches on the sensitive issues of personal privacy and free society. But, she concluded, only an insignificant number of citizens would be opposed to national registration and having a national ID card. Now, there was a lot of opposition, but there was also a lot of support for her proposal. The interview she gave really stirred up a tempest, and the issue of a national ID card has struck a national nerve, as one of the editorials wrote afterwards. The Wall Street Journal said, "A free people does not submit willingly to government control measures, however innocent they may seem. A society lives by its symbols, and any government-issued ID card is a symbol of authority." There were many people who criticized her proposals, the ACLU, many public officials, but many people also wrote in to Frances G. Knight, and I was able to examine her personal files in the Library of Congress. Many people wrote in saying they were in favor. In fact, at some point she conducted an analysis and she said that 68% of the people who wrote to her were in favor of a national ID card. But we also have public opinion data from this period, right? We have a 1977 Roper poll which showed that 51% of people supported a mandatory ID card. And of those who were opposed, 29% actually favored issuance of a tamper-resistant social security card, right? So even those who were opposed were still in favor of at least improving the social security card. A Gallup poll from 1980 found an even larger majority. When asked, do you believe everyone in the United States should be required to carry identification cards, 62% of the people said yes. Now, Frances G. Knight was not the only public figure in the 1970s to support national ID cards. Fyodor Hesburgh was another one. He was, of course, the president of Notre Dame University and the chairman of the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy. He endorsed national ID cards in the early 1980s, but the proposals were not welcomed by many other people participating in the conversations and discussions during the during the time of the commission and when the commission finally issued its report in 1981, it did not recommend a national ID card. And over 20 years later, sociologist Joseph Eaton, whom I've quoted earlier, when he wrote a new book in 2003, he actually dedicated the new version of his book to Theodore Hesburgh and said that September 11th, 2001 might not have happened had Hesburgh advocacy of national ID cards has been supported. So that was a very, very interesting statements. Now, in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan at one point came close to agreeing to a national ID card after a proposal was made by his Attorney General. But again, his advisors were critical, so the issue was quickly dismissed. Immigration reforms in the late 80s and 1990s kept on bringing the issue up. And then finally, after 9/11, we again had proposals for national ID cards, but again they led nowhere. After 9/11, it was discovered that all but one of the 9/11 hijackers acquired some form of U.S. identification, some by fraud. We learned, in fact, that the 19 hijackers had 30 different pieces of U.S. identification between them. And when the 9/11 Commission, examined this, they issued a statement saying that secure identification should begin in the United States. The federal government should set standards for the issuance of birth certificates and sources of identification, such as driver's licenses. Fraud in identification documents is no longer just a problem of theft. At many entry points to vulnerable facilities, including gates for boarding aircraft, sources of identification are the last opportunity to ensure that people are who they say they are and to check whether they are terrorists. But again, no national ID card was introduced, and there was really no serious, meaningful discussion about the benefits and disadvantages of having one. What did come out of Congress was the Real ID Act of 2005 that deals with the security of the driver's licenses, which are state issued, and what the act means is that states need to adopt certain issuance standards in order for the federal government to accept those licenses for things like boarding aircraft, and many states have been very opposed to those proposals. The DHS has been pushing the date for implementation further and further. We now know that January of 2018 is when states or when people will have to have licenses that are compliant with the act. But again, no national ID card debate as such. So to conclude, the conventional wisdom is that Americans are and have always been staunchly opposed to national ID cards, but the historical evidence reveals a more complicated story. In the past, some policymakers and members of the public have supported proposals for national ID cards, and many today see national ID cards more positively than conventional wisdom would let us believe. My research shows that popular support for national ID cards, as measured by public opinion, letters to Congress, and letters to newspapers, has been significant over the last 100 years, and did, in fact, at several points, represent a majority view. Today, controversies over immigration, identity theft, voter ID laws, profiling of terrorist suspects, the Real ID Act, the issuance of driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, all are likely to keep identification documents at the forefront of developments. Again, I don't think it's likely that any major discussion on national ID cards will emerge in the future, but Americans need to be ready for a discussion about the future of identification. And I think to do so, it is helpful to know the past. So hopefully my research can be of a little help there. So thank you so much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions, hear comments, and if we don't have time to get to everyone, then I would certainly welcome you all to contact me over email, and we can talk further about this. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Raise your hand if you have a question.
Excellent.
I thought I had a good grasp of American history, but virtually everything you said was new to me.
It means the world to me to hear that. Thank you.
I've jotted down a dozen or so minor things, and I'll share them with you. But for now, when you were talking about the Waldron bill and the fact that there was, the letters went to the Senate and basically the House was ignored, did you know whether there was a campaign by anyone in particular? And how did that campaign work?
That's a very good question. So I wasn't able to find evidence of that would like directly point me to a campaign, but I was able to see that, for instance, many letter writers identified themselves as members of the like women's Jewish group, for instance, like, or they would identify themselves as members of a veterans group, right? So I was able to find some documents from the veterans groups where I know that there must have been, you know, some efforts to kind of encourage the members to write in individually. So yes, there certainly were kind of big groups of people who identified themselves with a certain organization that wrote in, and they all wrote independently. They all wrote from, you know, from many different parts of the country, but many would identify themselves as a member of an organization. Yes, and the interesting part you mentioned about all the letters going to the Senate rather than to the House. This is something that I've always been intrigued at. You know, looking at the documents here at the archives. At what point do we know that, you know, the Senate bill made people, you know, more interested in the subject, whereas the House one didn't? And at what point this is simply a matter of preservation of documents, right? That the Senate documents, for some reason, were simply better preserved than the House ones for this particular bill, and I think that's obviously difficult to know. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Do you know whether the bills in either the Senate or the House during World War II even got a hearing?
No, they never got out of committees. Not a single one.
Not even with a hearing?
Not that I know of. No.
Do you know why who blocked them?
I don't, and that is kind of the missing piece of the puzzle for me. That I got to see a little bit of the internal correspondence between the people in the committees, but I didn't. You know, I don't have any records that said, you know, very clearly this is the reason why they're not going through. At some point, I saw a couple of documents coming from the Department of Justice. Coming from the Attorney General's office, and references to, you know, the president not being in favor of something, but what the actual reason was, I cannot say with any great authority. It would simply be speculation on my part. Go ahead.
You mentioned that you thought that there would not be a national ID. What about a national driver's license?
So this is a good question. I've mentioned the Real ID Act, and Jim Harper, who's from Cato here, knows a great deal about this. The Real ID Act is very specific in keeping driver's licenses as state-issued documents. There are critics of the act, right, who argue that by standardizing the issuance requirements and by standardizing the security features on the driver's licenses, you are making them national. Now, coming from outside of the United States, coming from Poland, I think I have a different view of what national is versus what state issued is. So I think that they will continue to be state issued. The question is, how far will something like Real ID go? And I do have to say, states did make tremendous progress on fulfilling the requirements of the Real ID Act. Again, there was a lot of opposition, and the deadlines were being pushed. What it seems to me is that we're going to keep state-issued driver's licenses. It's not going to be a national license, but they will be more standardized and have, you know, security features that are considered, you know, universally desirable by the Homeland Security authorities? That's a great question as well.
Almost all the letters to the editor that you cited were written by women.
So this is interesting. So the letters that were written to the House and the Senate committees, almost all of them were written by women. I agree. The letters to the newspapers, they were almost all written by men.
And that seems like interesting in itself. I don't know whether
It
it's
is.
statistically significant. But it seems interesting.
And so when I first noticed that all the initial letters were written by women, that's when I started digging a little bit further, and I've noticed that group of American Jewish women groups where like that name was kind of appearing. So I'm like, okay, maybe all those women are a member of a certain group. But then when I started looking at the letters to the newspapers, they were almost all of them written by men. I agree. This in itself is, I'm sure, is of some importance, and I should probably look at it first. I'm glad you've noticed this too.
Well, someone who writes on the internet, if all the women were writing because they were being channeled by a particular interest group or two, that would be one thing. It wouldn't be wouldn't necessarily be as much of a sociological phenomenon. I'm not a sociologist, but as if just sort of spontaneously women chose that vehicle and men chose another vehicle.
Right. Right. I agree. This is a very interesting part. Thank you.
So the two very different questions. One is, I do think with the Social Security numbers, we do have a sort of national registration system, at least, which, while perhaps not mandatory, is almost universal. And I think it is now, has gotten to the point where Americans are given Social Security numbers at birth. And with the Real ID requirement, you now have to supply a Social Security card in order to get a proof of Social Security number in order to get a driver's license. So the state-issued driver's licenses are now tied into a national database of Social Security numbers. So it would seem that while not an actual national ID card, you do have a national ID system. The other thing that I'm wondering about for a political scientist is that I would like to hear a little bit more about the politics here. That is, I haven't heard the terms conservatives or liberals mentioned in the talk. I would imagine that, yes, libertarians might be opposed to this, but other than that, this might be more of a right-wing issue, just as with the voter ID requirements, those tend to crop up more in Republican-dominated states because it is in their interest to sort of get the immigrants, the poor, the African Americans out of the system. So I'm wondering whether in the national ID debates there have been those kinds of political shadings as well.
Yeah, so you're making two really, really interesting points. So the first one about the Social Security numbers and driver's licenses. Social Security numbers are very different from national ID cards numbers, and the very fact that your Social Security card says that you're not supposed to carry it on you, you're supposed to keep it in a safe place, it makes a huge difference, right? From a card that has your picture on it, we know Social Security card does not. Social Security cards is made of this flimsy piece of paper. Those really high-tech national ID cards nowadays are made from something very, very different. Social Security cards are easy to counterfeit. National ID cards in most countries worldwide are much more difficult to counterfeit. And finally, Social Security numbers are really no longer unique to a person, right? There are so many instances of fraud in Social Security numbers where one number can be used by hundreds, if not more people. I mean, this is part of those big conversations we have about immigration reforms, right? And about people using a number fraudulently, and the number being used by multiple people. So that's what I would say about Social Security numbers and Social Security cards. And then as far as driver's licenses are concerned, I did not have time to talk about the kind of contemporary part of my research, but there are many Americans that do not have driver's licenses, and this is something that comes up now with those voter ID debates, right? Where many people think that some kind of a voter card should be required when you vote, and many people say no, this will have a disfranchising effect on people because especially the minorities, African Americans, the elderly do not have driver's licenses. And if you look, there are many different sources of data on this, but they basically give you a range of between 6 and 21% of people in the United States who do not have driver's licenses. And we're talking people over the age of 16, right? We're not including kids in this group. Now, that is a large group of people. Again, there are many different sources of this information, and they provide slightly different percentages. But if we're talking about communities where up to 1/5 of the people do not have a driver's license or a state-issued ID card, then I don't think we can talk about a national universal document. But I absolutely take your point. Now, as far as the whole political stuff is concerned, so my book manuscript is about that big, and I have, for your convenience, tried to summarize everything in a 40-minute talk. Yes, I do talk a lot about politics, and one of the reasons why I love this subject, and I've enjoyed researching this over the years, is that I actually don't think it feeds very neatly into that conservative-liberal divide that we are so familiar with on many issues. At one point in the manuscript, I say that this is an issue that really puts a lot of strange bedfellows together, both in terms of support and in terms of the opposition. Because on the conservative side, you have people on the libertarian side of the spectrum who might oppose national ID cards. But I also conducted a lot of interviews with people in the Homeland Security community, people in very, very influential conservative think tanks and other conservative circles who very much are in favor of a national ID card because they think that this is something that we absolutely need from the security point of view. And then on the liberal side of things get also very interesting because you have people who, for all sorts of reasons, believe that a national ID card is not a good idea, but you also have people who believe that it actually is a great idea because it's a great equalizer, right? So whether you're an immigrant to this country, whether you're a naturalized citizen or a native-born citizen, whether you might not even be a citizen but might be issued a national ID card, with a resident notation on it. That it's actually something that equalizes us all in this country. So I do think that it's not an issue that very neatly divides into the two sides. But again, I'll be happy to talk more about this, and hopefully once the book comes out, you will all be able to read more about this too.
I believe our time has expired. Thank you, Magdalena, for a really enlightening presentation on a fascinating issue that's kind of below the surface. And thank you also for bringing out the congressional and documentary dimensions of it so well.
Thank you, and thank you again for all your help, Richard. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for your excellent questions. I really appreciate them too. Thank you.